Howdy, folks, and welcome to the Hunting Stories Podcast. I'm your host, Michael, and today we're going to be hearing from Philippe Grenade-Willis, who is a podcaster, an artist, a hunter, a trapper, a forager. He really wears a lot of hats, and he caught my attention on Instagram, got me into his podcast, and I highly encourage that you all listen to it as well. It's called Our Numinous Nature. I'm not going to go into too many details because I don't want to ruin it for Philippe, who goes over a lot of this stuff in the podcast. So I'm going to stop there. I just want to say thank you very much for tuning in. Now let's let Philippe tell you his stories. All right, Philippe, welcome to the Hunting Stories Podcast. How you doing?
Well, thank you for having me very much. Yes, I am Philippe Grenade-Willis. I'm an artist, and my work is illustration. I'm an illustrator, and we live in the mountains of West Virginia. We just moved here about 6 months ago. Before that, we were in kind of the more hills of Virginia, like the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, I didn't tell you this yet, but I found your Instagram page. Obviously, I've been connecting with you there. Your artwork absolutely stood out. It's what got me clicking through things. You do great work. And then, of course, I found your podcast, and it's one of the more interesting podcasts that I found out there. I found myself falling down this pit of hunter podcasts where it's all like how to do this and how to do that. And that's kind of where, that's where the idea of this podcast came. I'm like, I just want to hear people's stories. And you've even taken it, one step farther. You go into history, you go into folklore, fauna, flora, everything. And it's super interesting stuff. So I want to make sure that people are aware of your podcast. So maybe you can give us a little bit of information on that just to kick things off, because I love it. And I want to make sure that we're sharing it with the people that are listening.
Well, I really appreciate that. It's called Our Numinous Nature. The word numinous means like, I'm very into the psychology of Carl Jung, and he was very much into like the interpretation of dreams and kind of these psychological patterns in people's lives and how to kind of understand yourself as deeply as possible so that you can fully express who you are in this lifetime and obviously be a better person, all sorts of stuff like that. But he has a word called numinous, which means like spiritual, like a spiritual moment, like a heightened moment. And I just found that people were telling me like really wild stuff all the time. And I was like, I honestly felt a duty to start recording some of these stories. And at first I was getting hired by herbalists, a lot of people in the nonprofit for a plant world in Appalachia. So I certainly did not know very much about plants at that time, but I was being hired. Yeah, I was being hired to illustrate for people who are kind of educating about Appalachian medicinal plants like ginseng, golden seal, black cohosh, Solomon seal. These are all these plants that grow in Appalachia that are like incredibly medicinal, but they're also like highly they're kind of at risk because they get dug up and they're not very well protected. There's not very, it's not like hunting where it's like there are biologists who are every year figuring out what is going to work for the animals in the landscape. It's not regulated that well. So some of these nonprofits have kind of taken it upon themselves to help protect some of these plants that are being overly used. So I started learning a lot about herbalism, and a lot of the people in the herbalism, especially some of the women, they just have like an incredible perspective on life. I mean, they're so spiritual, and they just like talk about communicating with plants, stuff that's like, I don't have experience with that. So I just like hearing different perspectives. And so the podcast, sometimes I'm talking to like a super spiritual, like new agey herbalist lady. And then other times talking with like a folklorist about like the cryptids in West Virginia or hunters or outdoorsmen. And I'm just always just trying to reach for some kind of deep soul. The goal would be to kind of reach some kind of soul, whatever that is. And so, it's a lot of folklore, a lot of history and flora and fauna. And then I always hope to have someone tell a story or two.
Yeah, absolutely. I just listened to I don't know what episode number it was, but it's the one where you had Mike Hull, the human tracker, right?
Oh
And
my God.
so that was such an interesting episode. And then hearing his stories about tracking bears, and it just got me
Oh,
fired up. And I was like, man, I have a lot of work to do to learn how to hunt animals better. This
oh,
guy's got it together. It was an amazing episode.
thank you. Yeah, that guy's amazing. That one was a really good balance because, like, if some of the new agey stuff is too much for some people, like that, he was an amazing balance of like real grounded, he law enforcement, but then also like had told quite religious experience um, when he was kind of struggling, uh, being depressed, struggling while working in a prison,
Yeah.
and so he was a good balance of kind of all things, like hard stuff, like tracking humans who've like done crimes, to having a spiritual experience. So I found that was awesome. He's an amazing guy.
Yeah, I was driving around antelope hunting, trying to spot some of those speed goats,
Oh,
and was listening to that. And I was like, this is just the perfect setting to be listening to this. So I was like, I wonder if he could track someone through these grass fields because it's a
mm,
Comanche National Grasslands out here in Colorado. So it's just
mm.
flat and grass. And I'm like, I wonder what this guy would do. I wonder if someone could get away from this guy. It's just very interesting stuff. So I want to make sure we get that out there. I'm going to put links to your podcast and
Thank you
your
so much.
website so people can find those. Your Instagram, of course, so they can check out your art in the show notes. So I encourage everyone listening to do that. But why don't we do this, Philippe? Why don't we tell the people a little bit about? I mean, obviously we're here for hunting stories, so let's tell them about your history with hunting. How long have you been doing it, and when did you pick it up, and why?
Totally. So I am definitely still pretty new. I think maybe this will be my sixth year. Um, Hunting in my life, my any background was I grew up in the suburbs of Northern Virginia. So you live on like a half acre. Hunting was not in my immediate family, but I had an uncle who lived in rural Virginia. We would visit him on holidays, and him and his children, they all for sure hunted. So my cousins who were like 10 years older than me, they were all deer hunters, archery and firearms. And so it was in my peripheral. Obviously, I had eaten
Mm-hmm.
venison on these special occasions. I had gone out as a little kid. I always say, I've told this before, but this was like one of the most striking hunting visuals. Was I was probably like 8 years old, and again, I've had no hunting experience, and I'm at it was must have been like Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve, and it was dark. There was snow on the ground, and my cousin comes in, cold, and he says he's much older, like 10 years older than me, and I'm
Uh-huh.
probably like 8, so he's probably like 18 or 20 years old. He comes in and says, like, I got a deer, and I go and I go with him into the darkness as this little suburban kid, and and we go through the snow, and he finds the deer, and I watch him field dress it. And the most striking image that is ingrained in my memory is in this super low dark light, him cutting, opening up the stomach, and just like huge billows of steam, like a vent, like a street
Yeah.
vent in the city of New York, just like pouring up into the sky. And he accidentally cut, I remember very strikingly, he accidentally cut into like the stomach. So it smelled absolutely awful, like, like feces.
Yeah.
And so it was a very striking moment for me as a little kid. But
Interesting.
yeah, but I never hunted. I got into paintball and did some dumb stuff as a kid, like trying to shoot a bird with a paintball, stuff like that. Felt really
Yeah.
bad. I hit a squirrel one time, felt terrible.
Yeah.
But then I was 30 years old. I had lived in New York City for 10 years. I went up there for film school. I never really got my film work off the ground and was very frustrated and was clearly at some like transition period in my life, trying to figure out what am I going to do. Nothing's really working, kind of feeling like life was no longer very interesting. And I was starting to illustrate. I was starting to be an illustrator, and I was feeling a very intense urge to move out of the city. I started getting hired by these nonprofits to illustrate for some of their plant projects, like I spoke about before. And I was offered a cabin, and it was exactly the same rent as my little room in Brooklyn. So I said, I'm doing it. And I moved down there and lived in the Blue Ridge Mountains. But one of the most intense things was I was like, I have to learn how to hunt. I have to learn how to hunt. And this was like right at the beginning of Meat Eater, like really getting started on their
Yeah.
podcast. All of their early books were coming out. So yeah, I had my uncle who ended up being a bit of a mentor. Like he let me hunt my first deer by myself on his property with his 30-30 lever action. But really, like my mentors were like those early books, those early Meat Eater books, uh, their early podcast, YouTube videos. Like when a few years after that, I learned how to do some trapping, and that was just like fully.
Yeah.
I had zero mentors. That was just learning from trapping podcasts and from YouTube because it's like I have no one to show me this.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's funny. We're roughly the same age, and we've been hunting for roughly the same amount of time. And I can say that,
Nice.
like, I started again with the Meat Eater stuff, and I've read all
Mm-hmm.
of Stephen Ranello's books, American
Mm-hmm.
Buffalo, and the Hot Couture.
Those
Uh,
books
you
are
know,
awesome.
yeah, they're all phenomenal books. And I actually have some of his newer stuff in my library waiting to be read, like the one about raising kids in the wild. So
Mm.
it's just funny. It's such a I don't know. I feel where you're coming from with how you started because it sounds very similar to me, except I wasn't in New York. I was in the Western states here in Colorado. Actually, at the
Mm.
time, I was in Washington, living in Washington. So
Okay.
and my first hunt was actually an elk hunt with a muzzleloader with
Oh,
my in-laws, my father-in-law and my brother-in-law. So it
that is
separates a little
epic.
bit there, man, but a very very similar start.
That is epic.
Yeah, well,
Did you
epic is
get that?
one way. We did get a bull elk, and I'll share a picture with you sometime.
Oh,
My brother-in-law, I've actually shared this story on my episode with
okay. I have to listen to that one.
I'm drawing a blank on who, but basically me and my brother-in-law both shot the same elk. It was
Mm.
kind of a lot of chaos. There were bulls about to fight. There was about 30 or 40 cows. It just
Wow.
got crazy, and we shot the same bull. So, but that's all right.
Wow.
We shared the meat, so we're both happy about it.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
Man, what a majestic creature. I've never even seen one. And just I went down to Kentucky for the podcast a few weeks ago.
Oh yeah.
And that region, so it's right on the line of southwestern Virginia and Kentucky. Right there is where there's a bunch of
Oh
the
yeah.
reintroduced elk. Like, I can't imagine seeing one of those in like the Appalachian Mountains. Just in the
Yeah.
forest, it'd be so majestic.
I've heard that they're getting some monster elk in that area. So the Rocky Mountain Elk
Mm,
Foundation, the people who
mm,
really piloted all that and got the elk into those other areas. But Pennsylvania,
mm.
Kentucky, all sorts of places on the East Coast are starting to have elk herds, and there are some really big, majestic elk out there. So
Mm.
it's I think every elk hunter's dream is to hunt some eastern elk, but I just don't
Really?
think it's too realistic. Yeah, it's very hard tag to get unless
Yeah,
you
I,
live in
I,
those states.
yes, I tried to do the Kentucky lottery last year.
That's
Interesting.
awesome. That's awesome. I hope you get it someday.
That would be cool. That would be cool.
Cool. So I kind of cut you off there. I don't know if you want to go any more into kind of how you started. Obviously,
Yeah. So
we're talking about Ranella there, and then your hunting and trapping and all that.
yeah. So I wouldn't quite say he wasn't really a mentor. I didn't really have like a straight up mentor, but I had a bunch of older men that helped me out a little. Like
Hmm.
when I first moved down, I moved from New York. I moved to this cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, which was only about an hour from where I grew up in the suburbs. And my mom and stepdad had actually they built a house out in that general area a few years before. So I was able to hunt on their 30 acres. I was able to at first borrow my stepdad's gun. He had taken a bear. They had a little cherry orchard, and I don't really want to. I don't really want to say that he hunted bear. It wasn't. He's not really a hunter. He's just taken some game on their property.
Yeah.
But he did let me borrow for the first like 2 years. I used his rifle and I used his shotgun for the first year for squirrel. So I had I'm very fortunate that I had like the tools and
Yeah.
I had like the private land to make life a little bit easier, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's out there in the East, you have to have access to some kind of private land. It's don't quite
Mm,
have the Colorado has 2 million acres of public land. Probably not the case where
epic.
you are.
Actually, pretty epic where we are in West
Oh,
Virginia, where
really?
we just moved. It's probably almost a million, and then Virginia is like almost a million. But it's like along, along the edge. It's along the western edge of Virginia and the eastern edge of West Virginia.
Oh, that's
So
amazing.
the culture here, the big culture where I am, is the bears with the dogs. Like in these little towns in on the edge of Virginia and on the edge of West Virginia, you see the houndsman trucks. I mean, every like 20 cars is a truck with the houndsman box on the back. It's like
Wow.
huge here because basically like you'll have houses in the hollows and in the valleys, but every mountaintop you look around is like public land around here.
Oh,
But
that's
so
amazing.
it can be hard to get into it because you don't have access at the bottom. But it's definitely the culture is a lot of the bear dogging for sure.
That's amazing. Do you have any contacts out there? Have you tried that?
Even like literally like my some of my neighbors just like 1 minute down the road have like 18 dogs or something. But I I
Wow.
I have gone out with some friends. They're pretty new. They're in Virginia and they got their first bear last year. So I went out with them once, didn't see a bear. I'm probably going to go out with them a bunch this year. I did enjoy it, but it's a little crazy. I mean, it's like, it's just not what you expect. Like
Yeah.
they let go of the leash of the dog and the dog disappears, goes over the top of a mountain. And then it's just like, how do you get your dog back? And I guess you just got to go get it. And then you like
Yeah.
get in a truck and drive around the other side of the mountain. It's kind of crazy.
That is crazy. Yeah, I've
Yeah.
I'm familiar with it. I think in the West it's more common for people to do that with like cougar hunting. But it's not something
Yes.
I've ever really dabbled in. It's something I'm super curious about and I'd love to try, but I've got plenty of other hunting I need to figure out before I move on to dog hunting cougars.
Yeah. I mean, that's so cool. What an
Yeah.
epic thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was telling you beforehand that I'm going to give you an exception. Normally, everyone's got to tell their own stories, but I know that you connect with so many interesting people that I was like, if you have a story that's just stuck in your mind, I'd love for you to hear it as long as we give credit to whoever told the story. But why don't we dive into whatever stories you want to tell us today, Philip? If it's yours, if it's someone else's, just let us know and kind of set the stage for us because I'm excited to hear, even though you've only been doing it for a little amount of time, what experiences you've had.
Okay. Well, I think I'll probably stick to my own, but I will say before that, one of the podcasts I did was with a guy who's really into cryptids. So that's like creatures that like it's like folklore creatures like Bigfoot, and I think
Yeah.
a lot of the times that stuff to me is like so corny. Like that I'm not like really that interested in it, but this guy, the way he's really into the fact that like locals in West Virginia, like farmers and stuff, want to tell him their stories. And so I'm re-interviewing him tomorrow to do another one with him. But what I found interesting about him is, when you see like Bigfoot stuff on TV, it's so dumb. But then he was kind of like showing me newspaper clippings that all of like the early kind of like Bigfoot sightings, like 1800s, it's all
Yeah.
hunters. It's like hunters that are up in the mountains that say they saw this bizarre thing. And so
Yeah.
seeing these old newspaper clippings from, people that are doing what we're doing, that are like really deep in the mountains, I found that so fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of my other podcasts with Ross Kearney, he's just a buddy of mine. He was hunting in Pennsylvania. And in his episode, he tells us a story where he had 2 full minutes of looking at something that he had no idea what it was. And if he had to put a name on it, he would say Bigfoot.
No way.
On the same 2 minutes of
Oh
just
my
staring at this
God.
creature on the
Oh
same
my
property
God.
that he found these like burial stones, these weird ancient burial stones that
Oh
are
my
the
God.
size of half of a car that just one day disappeared on his property that he's living on right now. So crazy stuff. There's always
I,
crazy stuff out there in the woods.
I can't wait to listen to that one.
Yeah, Ross Kearney is his
I
name.
need to
He's
listen to
a
that.
great guy, cancer survivor, just a fun person to talk to. So
I can't wait. Thank you. I'll like that one a lot.
yeah, absolutely.
Um,
So go set the stage. What's your first story?
Okay, let me think here. Let me. Well, one that I was thinking about. You brought up the man tracking and tracking the bear and the laurel. Um, so we have early seasons for bear in Virginia. Back when I lived in Virginia, and so obviously, like I was kind of saying, the culture here is doing it with the dogs. You're not allowed to
Hmm.
bait in Virginia. Most people, it sounds like from everything I've gathered, talking to lots of people, they either get a bear by chance, or like they're deer hunting and they see a bear, or and they have a bear tag,
Yeah.
or they're one of these houndsmen, and that's the way to do it in this general area. It's very thick in the eastern deciduous forest. Um, so I had been listening to Clay Newcomb's old podcast where it was more like how to his
Yeah.
bear hunting magazine podcast, and he would talk about how to track bears basically in national forests in the East Coast. So I was like, I need to try that. And we have this early season. It's actually next week in Virginia. It's late September, and I was like, I need to do that. So the first year I tried, I went on the West Virginia border, but I couldn't get away from the guys with the dogs. So yeah, I saw two bears that night camping. I spent 3 days camping at the
Hmm.
bottom of this super steep ravine. I saw two bears at night, and I saw one being with a dog after it, like the next day. But so it was that's kind of like the first attempt. And I was like, well, the next year I need to make sure to get away from the houndsmen. Not because I like dislike them, but how can I compete with, you
Yeah.
can't even compete. So I was like, so my strategy was, why don't I pick a chunk of national forest that's not so deep and remote, that's actually like a little bit, has houses at the bottom, and
Okay.
like a
Yeah.
series of mountains, but there's houses at the bottom instead of like the remote uh, western edge of Virginia in the Appalachians. It was more like the Blue Ridge Mountains. There's some chunks in national forest that are a little smaller. I was like, maybe that's the way to do it. So I tried that. I camped out for 3 days. Um, with my podcast, an element that I've been kind of struggling with is like having like a spiritual life. Like I definitely pray, and
Hmm.
I'm just very interested in spirituality. I'm interested in all religions. I'm interested, like, does it work? Like if you pray for something. And my girlfriend she's very interested in folklore and mythology, and maybe more kind of like some of the Wicca type stuff, just interested in pagan ritual, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So she was like, why don't you try praying to the bear before the bear hunt?
Oh,
And I was like,
interesting.
okay. I was like, all right, yeah, let me try that. And I'm kind of thinking, I'm always wondering, even like I struggle, a lot of people meditate these days. I struggle with that. I'm always like,
Yeah.
this is dumb. It's not working, stuff
That's
like that. So
yeah. That's exactly what I think as I've tried meditating. It's not for me either. I'm always just like, why can't my brain stop thinking?
exactly. So, I'm thinking, well, I guess there's no harm in trying to pray to the bear, whatever that means. So, I like go outside in the dark the night before the hunt. The moon is out. I like light a candle. I have a bear skull from my stepdad who he got on their property. And I just kind of said, like, can we like let us have a successful, respectful, um, safe hunt? I'm doing these things by myself. I've got the GPS, you know, this special garment in case I break my leg. I'm by myself and I need to but I'm by myself. There's no cell phone reception.
Hmm.
So, I do that. I kind of think, well, I don't know if that's going to do anything. But the next day, the hunt begins. It's 3 days long. And I was following some of those tips from the old bear hunting magazine, both the magazine and the podcast, just try to find the sign, trying to go until you find fresh scat, look for where the acorns are falling, look for those rolled rocks, look for logs that have been rolled over, and just go until you find sign. So, I went out there. It was an area I had already scouted, but I just started finding scat. And I'd find like a big pile, then a little pile, big pile. And I kept going. I kept going. Not, I don't know how far I was, but probably an hour or so. And I just kept finding more scat. And I was like, this is incredible that I'm just the ability. I'm clearly tracking. Like how fresh, I don't know.
Yeah.
That point, I ran out of water and I was getting insanely thirsty. So I actually went all the way back to my truck to refill my water. But then I went all the way back and restarted the tracking. I came over this hill, this area where I just felt like this is the spot. And right as I came over the hill was a mom bear with two cubs. And I was
Uh,
like, I can't believe it worked. I was like, I can't believe I was able to track like one of the coolest animals ever.
oh yeah.
And that felt like the day was done. Like that was the success. Like how would I possibly find enough? You obviously can't shoot the mom with
Yeah.
cubs. So just being able to see them was the success of the day. And the next day it actually rained nonstop. So I decided to go back home and not camp that night. But the third day, I was like, well, I was able to find bears. So let's do that again. So I had learned from the first day that the bears were on a certain elevation line. Like I had gone all the way to the top of the mountains. And once I got like 3/4 up the mountain, there was no sign anymore. So it's like, okay,
Yeah.
they're staying at a
Huh.
certain line on the mountain. And then I realized, well, that line on the mountain is where all the acorns are. So it's like, I'm going to stick to that line. And I just walked that line across this ridge until I found just an enormous patch of bear sign. I mean, just scat everywhere. Um, all of these turned rocks, all the holes in the ground where they dig up the yellow jacket nests.
Yeah.
And I was like, just sit here, like sit over this for however many hours necessary. And so, I sat over that and, 2 hours passed and I'm like, maybe I should get up and keep moving. I walked away a little. And I was like, no, go back, go back. And I went back and around 5 o'clock. So I'd probably been there, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours. I hear something coming and it's a little bear and it ran in front of me. I, raised my rifle. I had it in the scope. It didn't feel right. It was too small.
Mhm.
I think it might have been legal. I can't remember if Virginia is 75 pounds or 100 pounds, but obviously that's really small.
Yeah.
My
And that's not
feeling
easy
was
to field judge.
right.
Yeah.
My feeling was it was probably like the first year where it's by itself. They're with their mom for 2 years.
Yeah.
It seemed like it was the third year. It didn't feel right, but I had it in the scope. I had my rifle up, and I felt just this incredible sense of like outdoorsman achievement. Like in this 3-day hunt, I was able to find like a mom with two cubs and this teenage bear. And I was like, that was, I didn't do the kill. It wasn't the right time for my first bear, but it just felt like such a huge outdoorsman achievement to find them.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. It's exactly like you said with the tracking. It's fun to kind of put the puzzle pieces together, and like when you realize that topography line is where the acorns grow, and you started to figure those things out and put it all together. That's a big part of the allure and the enjoyment of hunting is solving these wilderness puzzles, right?
That's it. That's exactly it. Me and Vivian, my partners, we always kind of laugh because we call it like a wildlife investigation. Like when
Yeah,
you see some tracks outside, you're trying to figure out the story, like you said, or like that podcast with the man tracker. He's trying to figure out like a crime. Like yeah, a puzzle. And that's the tracking element just feels so, it really feels it really feels like outdoorsman skills and quality. And
yeah,
my personality, I'm not really interested in doing the game cameras and stuff. It just doesn't really cross my mind. And I know that is hurting my ability to be successful, but it's just not really what I'm interested in. So the tracking was like really fascinating to me.
Yeah, yeah, to each their own. I will say when I started hunting, the amount of poop that I stepped on to see how fresh it is drastically increased, right? Yeah, that's a big part of the puzzle. I think that's step one is just finding that scat and figuring out how fresh it is. So,
Hmm.
um, yep, that's awesome, man. That's a great story. So you went home after that just full of like content, or did you go back
I
out?
felt like it was I felt like it was a success, like a
Good.
hunting success. Um, so I have yet to get a bear. I had to take the year after that. I had to take off because we had to move unexpectedly, and that season is next week. So
Oh
I'm
man.
debating. Yeah, I'm debating whether or not to pay, the few $100s for the out of state, and because now I'm in West Virginia.
Yeah.
West Virginia does not have an early season where I'm at. So I'm debating whether or not to pay for it. I'm debating whether or not I'm a really skinny guy. I'm debating whether or not I could handle it, like the logistics of carrying. If I were successful I would have
Yeah.
to target like a medium sized, smaller bear, anyways, just because there's no way by myself in the mountains I could carry that many rounds of meat.
Oh, you could do it one step at a time. That's all there is to it, right?
I
I
guess, yeah.
I actually recently signed up for a pack out challenge because that was one of the things that concerned me. So I'm not a little guy. I'm like 6'4", 230
Mm,
pounds.
mm,
And so I'm a bigger guy. But it's carrying out loads and loads of heavy bags of meat is intimidating as a newer hunter.
mm,
And so I recently signed up for a Western Hunt Fest out here in Bailey, Colorado, hosted by the guys that do Pack 'em Out Apparel, and they had a pack out race where
mm.
me and my buddy had 200 and I think 60, 270 pounds, and we had a 1.5 mile mountain course to get it through. And yeah, I wasn't sure I'd be able to handle it. And there were some times going up some hills where I was like, this is dumb. Why am I doing this? I can't finish this. But we got through it and it felt great. So I have no doubt, man, that
So how
you
much
can
do you
do.
think you had in your pack?
Well, I'm a little bit bigger than my buddy. So my first pack I was probably just shy of 100 pounds, probably like
Yeah,
90 to
wow.
100 pounds. And then my friend, so one of us, part of the rules is one of you have to carry a bow with you for one of the
Mm,
trips, like you actually harvested an elk.
mm,
So I think that he had probably around 60 pounds and his bow, and I had about 90 to 100 pounds and no bow.
mm,
And then the next trip, I think I did less, probably like 80 pounds, and he did probably about the same, 50 to 60.
mm.
Yeah,
Very
I'm
nice.
telling you, we got second, but there were only three teams, but I feel good about that.
Hey, not
um,
bad.
but the team that won it, they did it all in one trip. This one guy had like 170 pounds on his back, and his brother had like another
Oh my
100
God.
pounds. And
Oh my God.
they were monsters. I was so impressed. So,
My God.
yeah. Yeah. But that being said, man, you can do it. I'm sure you'd be surprised what you can do, especially when you
Mm,
have that feeling of satisfaction, feeling of a successful hunt. So, um, yeah, I'm
mm.
encouraging you to go out there and shoot the biggest bear you possibly can.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Especially because then you'll have more meat, you'll have more bear
Oh yeah.
fat, which I cannot wait to fill up a bunch of jars with bear fat so I have cooking oil for the year. Like those
Oh
bears
yeah.
high on my list of something that I need to figure out how to hunt myself. In fact, I have on podcast number 2 spoke with Doug Bose, who wrote the book on black bear hunting. Now he
Mm,
does it in Washington, kind of like
mm,
northwestern Washington. So I'm
mm-hmm,
not sure how applicable that is to eastern bears, but
mm-hmm.
yeah, I've got his book and I've been reading through it. And unfortunately, my bear tag this year is going to be tag soup because of my injury that I told you about, where I took that spill. But
Yes. Yeah.
next year, I'm getting a bear. I'll tell you that.
Well, because you started talking about Washington, you've reminded me that one of my kind of gun mentors, like he would help me a lot with just like buying the right ammunition. He would give me suggestions on like what, large game rifle to buy, stuff like that. Very helpful. But he is Chilean, and
Oh,
yeah, really cool guy. But he is from Chile. He grew up in Washington. He's done his bear hunting. I think it's called Cascade National something. I don't know, Cascade Mountain Range or something like that.
yeah. The
But
Cascades are the mountains to the east of like Seattle, kind of in central Washington.
that's where he's done all of his bear hunting when he was younger. I think that was a lot of like glassing and hunting the blueberry fields is what he explained. So I think it's quite a bit different than here in the Appalachians. But but what you've sparked is a story he told me on so so like I said, he grew up in Chile, um in like in the Patagonia. I guess part of Patagonia is in Chile.
Huh.
Um
What is
and
real quick? What's his name? Just so we can make sure to give him full credit.
his name is Frank Escalona. I couldn't
Okay,
remember his last name. Escalona. That's right.
got it.
So yeah, Frank told me he told me he remained buddies with a bunch of guys down in Patagonia, and he would go there to like spend his summers and whatnot. And he would do a lot. He's all around through and through an outdoorsman. He would do a lot of fishing, I guess fly fishing down in Patagonia, and he was friends with some of these local guys. And also, he would send me some wild videos that they would hunt boars like on horseback with pistols. And I mean, it literally looks like, if you're familiar with some of those like classic Western painters, there's Remington and there's
Yeah.
Russell. Yeah, those famous painters. I mean, the videos he would send me look like that. These like enormous Patagonian landscapes, these men on horses with pistols and dogs chasing after hogs. It's wild stuff. So,
Sounds like something from Texas, but yeah, that's
ah,
amazing.
exactly. So he told a story where one of his fishing buddies, there was this lake like really deep in the mountains, and usually they would go like on expedition, they would go for like overnight trips or something. And his buddy went over into the mountains, um, to this lake to go fishing. None of the other guys could go that day. He told him he's going back there. And after like a day or so, the man's wife calls up the other fishing buddies and says, whatever this man's name is, I can't remember what it was. It's some Spanish name. He hasn't come back. So one of his closest friends goes to the lake, knowing that he was somewhere over there. And when they descend, I guess you go up these mountains and you descend down into this bowl where the lake is. And I mean, this is like real wilderness, Patagonia stuff.
Yeah.
They descend this bowl and they see this. The way he described it was like a chalkboard on the sand, on the gravel bank, like a chalkboard where the writing in the sand was this incredible commotion. And they looked further on and saw body parts of their friend.
Oh my God.
And they found out that he had been killed and eaten by a puma.
Oh my God.
And then I guess they must have gone back and got like, I don't know how it worked. I don't know if there was some like park service or how it works, but they got other people to track this puma and kill it. And they found their friend, like parts of their friend inside this puma.
Jesus.
So I was just like stunned to hear a story of like there are all the famous stories of the man eaters in
Yeah.
India, the man eating Bengal tiger in India, the man eating Siberian tiger in Siberia. I love those stories. I had never heard something like that from, South America, from a puma is a mountain lion. So
Yeah.
I'd never heard anything like that before. So that was astonishing to
God, yeah, I've never heard of it. Like in Colorado, we have tons of mountain lions, but there's
me.
very, very rarely ever an attack. I think the last one I could think of was a guy on a hike and like a baby mountain lion who didn't have its mom and was just kind of starving. Was like, well, I got no other choice. Let's attack this guy. So like he fought the baby mountain lion off, and he looked like he fought off a mountain lion, but he survived only because it was juvenile. But that's crazy. That is a crazy story.
Crazy.
You know, it
Have you seen one?
I'm sure they've seen me, but I have not actually seen one in the
Yes.
wild. Yeah. But you actually sparked up another story. So you were talking about Patagonia. I was talking with someone from Argentina, right? But they live a little
Mhm.
bit north of Patagonia, and this is just a weird tidbit that I didn't know, and I'm sure you didn't either. But when I met them, I was talking to them about hunting, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I do a lot of hunting, a lot of this and that." And I was like, "Well, what kind of hunting do people do in Argentina?" And she was like, well, parrots. And I'm like, well, this has got to be,
Oh my God.
I was like, this has got to be a translation error here. She doesn't mean parrots. And I'm like, I'm trying to explain like what a parrot is. And like, oh, hold on. I just pull up my phone. I pull up a picture of a parrot and I'm like, you guys hunted these, big green parrot. And she's like, oh yeah. Yeah. You just blast them. And I'm like, what? Apparently there's just so many of them that they're a nuisance. In fact, they land on the cattle in the area and they eat the eyeballs of the cattle and
Oh my
basically
gosh.
end up killing all this cattle. So the farmers and everyone out there just blasting parrots, and it's like a completely common thing down there near Patagonia in Argentina, which blew
Wow.
my mind. I couldn't comprehend that this wasn't just a translation error, but nope, they hunt straight up parrots in Argentina.
Do they ever eat them, or it's just like nuisance?
I think for her and what she's aware of, a nuisance, but I'm sure someone out there is eating them. It just not
That's
not
wild.
not not that she was aware of. So, but yeah, crazy stuff.
That's wild.
Yeah. So, God, that's funny. I you know what, and I also promised you a squirrel story, and as long
Yes,
as I'm
please.
telling stories, I'm going to give you a squirrel story. So, I live in the suburbs of the Front Range of Colorado, near
Hmm.
Boulder, just east of Boulder, and so we have a small property, nothing crazy, but our we have a lot of squirrels, ton of squirrels. And I'm an archery hunter, and so I set up a little range in my backyard. And
Hmm.
so these squirrels were kind of ripping apart my neighbor's stuff. They were just getting really frustrated. And they're like, "Can you just, you're a hunter? Can you kill these squirrels?" And I'm like, "I don't really know how to kill a squirrel." I was like, "Can't really fire my shotgun. I got to figure this out." And so my wife was like, "No, we don't need to do it." Even though I wanted to try and eat the squirrel, she was like, "No, no, 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 no." And then we got a brand new patio set basically, and it chewed through our patio set the first day we put it out there. So a huge hole in the side of this thing we just bought. And so my wife's like, okay, just don't tell me about it, because she has a problem with death, and she
Hmm.
loves that I'm a hunter, loves that I'm trying to provide food for the family, but she wants
Hmm.
nothing to do with the actual killing of anything. It just hurts her soul.
Hmm.
So I'm like, okay, that's totally fine. But then I start to think, how am I gonna get rid of these squirrels, in suburb? So basically, what I do is I take my two archery targets and I set one off on top of the other one, and about 4 inches back, and just put a bird feeder that we have in the yard right next to it, so that they would sit on my archery target. So then I look out my window one day, and there's a squirrel right in front of my archery target, and so I shoot down the side of my house, and so I'm like, okay, here's the opportunity. And the Argentinian girl is there. She's actually an au pair. She helps take care of our children. And then my father-in-law is there and my wife. And I'm like, darling, like, don't look outside. Okay, just go up to the room. And she's like, apparently that was too much. I let her know that something was going to happen, and that kind of ached at her. So she had a tough time with this. But I went around the side of the house about 30 yards, pulled my bow back, and drilled him. Just took the squirrel out. And the problem here, it was a perfect shot. I didn't use a broadhead because I was like, I'm not going to shoot broadheads in my backyard. I'll shoot a field point. Perfect center shot, center mass, but because it didn't inflict enough damage, not having a blade on it, the squirrel was unfortunately still alive, kind of wiggled his way all the way down to the fletchings. So I pulled the arrow. I actually took a broom to split the arrow to protect my hand from the squirrel, like wiggling its way back up the arrow. Took it over beside the house and kind of gave it a quick thump to put it out of its misery. My wife would not talk to me for a week. She was very, very
Oh,
upset. And the reason why is, and I didn't know this until about a month or two later, but when I hit the squirrel, she was hiding upstairs, but her father and our au pair cheered. So I didn't know they were cheering. So she was like, oh no, they're cheering on the death. So like she's got this deep ingrained problem with death. And now she's got people in her house cheering for it. So it's just a ridiculous.
oh my God.
I told her I was going to do it. Everything was fine until it was actually done. And then, yeah, I don't tell this story often because she hates to hear it and doesn't want to talk to me for a couple hours after I tell anyone about it. And I actually put up a little camera on my thing. So I actually have it all on video. Just because I was like, it would alert me when the squirrels were there. So that's how I found out the squirrel was there. But yeah, just a crazy little story. The only squirrel I've ever harvested, but hit it with my bow at about 30 yards. So proud of the archery shot. And yeah.
No, that's very impressive shot. Now, what
Yeah.
kind of squirrels are there?
Oh, I'm not a squirrel expert. Maybe you can give me a couple options and I can pick one out.
Oh, I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know. Is there like a Western gray squirrel? Like, I don't know. I thought there was not, it's not the same like it is out here.
You know, let me do a quick
Here,
Google
so
search.
here there's there's the eastern gray, which is the main one. There's these fox squirrels, which are so cool. I mean, they're like literally they're huge, like 2 or 3 times the size of a gray squirrel, and
Yeah.
they're really orange and a ton of meat, and they're a little bit more badass. And then there's like the little crazy red. I've only seen them up here in these mountains in West Virginia. These little like red squirrels with like little sharp ears. Those are funny.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm looking it up right now, and we have, and what I believe it is an American red squirrel, is what it
Okay.
looks like to me. But we also have these
Okay.
other squirrels out here. They're like solid black with like
Hmm.
pointy ears. Or you know what? Now that I'm on squirrel number two, it's a fox squirrel, is what it is, because it's got the big
Huh.
bushy tail. So yeah,
Interesting.
fox squirrel is what it is, and then we also have these crazy devil looking squirrels
Hmm.
when you're deep in the mountains. I'm not even sure what they are, but like it was
Hmm.
solid black with pointy ears. But yeah, it was just a fox squirrel, just standard fox squirrel. I will say that they did not show up in my yard for about a month after that,
They
and
got
then
the
they
message.
came. Yeah, they did, and my
Hmm.
neighbors, when they did come back, my neighbors were like, "All right, get another one," and I'm like,
Hmm.
"I cannot do that. I
You have to
respect my
become a
wife
trapper.
too much." That's true. That's true. I did buy a book on trapping for that and the skunks in the area. So
Good luck with that.
yeah, the only thing is I haven't looked into the legality. I don't actually think you can trap in the state of Colorado, but I'm gonna have to look into that.
Hmm. Yeah, I've heard something about something like that. Like you're not allowed to use the foothold traps on public land. I can't quite remember, but I do know that Colorado was getting pretty hard on the rules. I
Yeah.
think because of some of the animal rights people in Denver really going hard on the trapping.
Yeah, yeah. The majority of Colorado votes in ways that the hunters and trappers would not, and all the people of the western slopes, so the people that live west of Denver in the mountains,
Mhm.
they're the ones that are reaping the
Yes.
the negative effects of the people in Denver that are voting for things such as reintroduction of wolves, right? The dogs
Yes.
and
Heard a
cattle
lot
are being
about that.
slaughtered in northwestern
Mhm.
Colorado. And the vote was 51% yes and 50 or 49% no. But it was all
Mhm.
people on the in Denver basically that
Mhm.
voted for wolves to be moved into their neighbor's yard, but not their own.
Yeah, that's buck wild.
Yeah, it's some pretty crazy stuff. In fact, I told you about my November elk hunt that's coming up here. That's up in the area where the wolves are. So I haven't seen any, but they've
Mm.
been there. I've talked to the game wardens, and they said just keep your eyes peeled. So
Oh man, well I hope you get to see one because that's pretty neat to at least see
yeah,
one.
it would be pretty cool. I'd even settle for tracks, but
Mm.
of course, I'd rather that they not be there and disrupting everything out there and taking out the ungulate
Mhm.
population and all that. But if they're there, they're there. So
Mm.
awesome. Well, that was a great story about a puma. I mean, I went off
Oh
on my
yeah.
little tangents, but what other stories do you have, if any? If you want to save some for another day, I'd be happy to bring you back on after you've talked to another 100 people and have a bunch more great stories for us.
Yes.
Or I'd love to
Yes.
hear the story of the bear that you're going to take down this coming year.
Yes. 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 Um, I mean, do you want me to kind of do the raccoon story that I do in the very first podcast? I could do
That's up to
a,
you.
a shorter version. That one's a little more disturbing, but
It's up to you.
yeah, I'll tell that just because it was very powerful to me. It was very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
And
yeah.
you could
So
even give a little intro, kind of saying that like this is actually I give a longer version of this on my actual podcast. Try and get people to tune into that one because it was a great
yeah,
episode.
yeah. I give a so the my first episode from like 2 years ago of the podcast. I thought I thought that if I were going to try to get really raw and powerful things from other people, then I really needed to do something about myself first, so that it really felt like I'm also being very honest about experiences. So
Yeah.
having not grown up as a hunter, the killing at first was very intense. I would even say saying the word killing. I didn't even want to say the word kill or that I was a killer. Like just having lived in New York for 10 years, having grown up in the suburbs, I mean, the association with a killer is a person that you lock up in prison. So to acknowledge that, to say that that's what I was, because that's what you are when you're getting food, but that was very intense just to accept that in myself. So
Yeah.
my first experience with hunting, it was squirrels, and that was even pretty intense. Being holding one for the first time, my first dead animal in my hands, just how incredibly soft they were and how cute they were. It really like took my breath away. Like I wouldn't say I cried, but I just felt very overwhelmed by the intensity of seeing an animal that I had taken the life of.
That's a common theme. When I killed my first deer, I was with a guy that I'd met like 2 weeks before, and the first thing I did was like go over and just give him the biggest hug. It's just you have a lot of emotions when you
Oh my
harvest an
God.
animal. It's crazy.
Um, for sure. So first year, I got two deer, I think a doe and a spike, I think. And then the next year, I got two deer, um, smaller buck, and I think another spike. This is all on private lands. I'm just trying to get anything because it's just my
Yeah.
first time hunting. So I'm just trying to get a deer, try to get food. And uh, so I had kind of experienced squirrels and deers, and for some reason, every time I went to this hardware store, we have this strange store called Rural King. It's kind of like a Kmart, or like a no, I wouldn't say Walmart. It's a lot rougher than that, but it's kind of like a hard looking farm store. But you can get anything. Like you could get a pair of boxers, or you could get traps, or chicken feed, stuff like that. So
Yeah.
it's kind of a fun store. But I would go in the trapping aisle, and I just kept looking at these traps, and I'd look at the foothold traps, and I was like, "There's no way I can do this." I was like, I could never be a trapper. Like, this is so cruel. I didn't know anything about it. Like, I didn't, and so, but for some reason, I was pulled towards them. And so, I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, I'm very into the psychologist Carl Jung, and one element of his form of psychoanalysis is to pursue the things that you're scared of, but you feel called to them. So I really felt called to these traps. So I started learning all about them. I started learning, to my complete and utter astonishment, that modern traps they were designed with vets, with biologists. Um,
Huh.
Many of them have a gap in the middle that you can put your own hand into. I mean, it doesn't feel very nice, but you don't break your hand. It's like not there's no teeth on them. It's not like the 1800s. Um, yeah, many of them were designed. So I guess what happened was maybe in the 90s, the animal rights people got really hard on trapping. And that actually was very helpful because this is my understanding. It helped the industry kind of revamp what they were doing. And all these kind of new designs were made with gaps in the jaws of the trap so that the animal always has circulation. And these exact same traps that I was going to get were used by biologists to, for instance, in my home state of Virginia, the exact same trap was used to move otters from the eastern shore and the eastern side of Virginia back over the Blue Ridge Mountains, back on the western side of Virginia, where they had been extirpated since the old time days of trapping. They had been wiped out. So now there are otters everywhere. The Blue Ridge Mountain area, the Shenandoah National Park area, like the farmland around it, every farmer's pond I've found otter scat. I've trapped two in creeks, just on the tiniest creeks, like ankle deep water. So yeah, those traps are used for that. The MB 550, or I think there might be one larger, is used by biologists to relocate wolves, which you're just talking about. So
Yeah.
this blew my mind, and this was very helpful for me to feel okay with giving it all a try. So yeah, I decided, well, it looks as though the first thing a lot of people trap is a raccoon. So there's a WMA just about 20 minutes down the road from our house. Actually, probably only about 10 minutes down the road. And and I set some traps. It was super cold, January. The creek was all iced up, and I think about after 3 days, I went back there. Sorry, let me go back a little. I had this very intense feeling. I knew to trap raccoons using creeks is a good way of going about it because they'll walk the creeks. They sometimes will wash their food in the water.
Yeah.
Um, it's just you often find their tracks like in the banks along creeks.
I believe
Um,
it. I told you about that one deer where I hugged my buddy. When we actually did put up some game cameras and it was in a creek bed in Texas. And all I got on my camera was about 5,000 photos of raccoons. So I
there you go.
believe 100%. Maybe like 5 pictures of hogs, nothing of deer, but yeah, that's I would
Wow.
absolutely think if you're going to look for raccoons, the creek bed's a good place to start.
Wow. Yeah, exactly. So I'm walking that and I just kind of catch in the side of my eye this huge snag of a tree, this like big hollowed out tree. And I was like, that's the spot. And it was a patch of WMA. And there was I could see a game trail that was kind of pushed down. And then it went under a barbed wire fence onto someone's farm. And I was like, this is going to be the spot. You've got the farm, you've got this little trail going to this creek, and you got this big hollowed out tree. I was like, I guarantee I just had this intense feeling this was the place to put my trap. So I put my trap. 3 days later, I go back. Well, I go back every single day. You have to go every 24 hours. So nothing the
Okay.
second day, nothing the first day, nothing the second day. Third day, I'm going back. And I always kind of feel like once you get down a few days of trapping, I start to think that nothing's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I get over in that area and I see the raccoon. And I'm like, oh my God, here it is. I trapped a raccoon. And I had a 22 on me with a scope, and this would be my third year of hunting. So I'm still pretty new. I'm still pretty new with owning guns, understanding how guns work and operate. And, I'm only like like a foot, well, maybe 2 feet from this raccoon. I pull my 22 up, I look through the scope and I fire. So I don't realize that that's not really how things work, that the bullet is not at that close of a range. The bullet is
Yeah.
not going where the crosshairs are in my scope. So the raccoon is not a swift, honorable, respectful dispatch. Now I have an animal that's going berserk in a chained trap. And I am like, oh my God,
Yeah.
making the worst. And I mean, to any trappers listening, mean I don't mean to paint trapping in a bad light because I do think it can be done in an ethical way. But there was a feeling to it that was very different than hunting. That hunting has a little bit more of like a timeless like adventure to it. Trapping in this instance almost felt more like I was an executioner.
Yeah.
And that was really disturbing. So I shoot, this raccoon is going crazy. I shoot again and again and again, not realizing I'm making the same mistake. I'm looking through the scope. I'm not hitting it in the head. I'm hitting it like in the shoulders and the chest. This thing is going ballistic. So I kind of like don't know what to do. I put my gun down. I grab like a tree, like a stick, and I like have to bludgeon this thing until it
Yeah.
dies. And that was like horrific. I
That's a
mean,
traumatic experience for sure.
it's traumatic. And from someone having never lived like grown up like this, it was like it's super violent and it really rattled me. And so I took my raccoon, I brought it back home. It was probably like half a mile into the WMA. It was pretty far in, for a WMA, at least for trapping. I got home. I was so unnerved. I told my girlfriend, I was like, I just felt like really rattled by this. I was really disturbed. I skinned it out. I saved the meat, and I noticed we had a little back sunroom which is where I would dry my hides as I got more into trapping. Later on, I got into some beaver trapping and stuff like that. So I had it hanging in that sunroom, and I like could not even look in that room. Like I couldn't look at that drying hide. Like I
Yeah.
just felt like I don't even really know what I felt. Just ashamed. I felt disturbed, and I was like, "What is it about this?" And obviously, I put an animal through prolonged suffering, but I think it was also kind of like a death of innocence where it was like I have this potential for violence. Like this is how obviously that scenario was set up for, it was a violent scenario. Hunting is violent. All these things are violent, but it was like the intensity and almost like the barbarity of the violence to finish this act was so intense for anything I had ever experienced up until that time. It was extremely disturbing to like accept that that existed in me. It was like this level of intensity.
Yeah.
And I found it very disturbing. I could not, we were going to eat that raccoon. I couldn't eat it. I didn't look at that meat for a year. And you know what? The strangest thing was I sent a handful of pelts. I went on to like do a bunch of beaver trapping for a farmer who had a bunch of flooding issues. We ate all those beavers. I didn't feel so much intensity about the beavers quite as much. But I sent all those pelts out to a tannery, so then it's like a year from the time when I killed that first raccoon. I get that box of pelts. When I opened that box of pelts and I saw the hide of that raccoon, I was filled with like such joy. And I felt that heaviness completely lift off of me. I felt that hide being so special, and I put a button on it so I could wear it around my neck while hunting in the winter. I can carry that raccoon. And I even felt like it was now an okay time to try eating the raccoon. And I cooked it up. I made barbecue. And the strangest thing was the entire time I ate the raccoon, I like could not stop laughing. Like it was like, it was like joy. It was like something
Yeah.
comical and outrageous in it. And I even had friends who are like super New Yorkers, born and raised New Yorkers. They were coming down to do a trip down to like Nashville. They stopped at our cabin. Both of them ate some of the raccoon, and they were like, that was incredible. They're like, that could easily be a pulled pork sandwich, from like a hot spot in Brooklyn,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was blown away that they tried it and ate it. And I just, yeah, there's something. So I have noticed there are some times when there's like a heaviness to some of these experiences. Like I won't go too into the story because it's not all that interesting, but in a very similar way, I once shot this little 5-point buck and I really wanted to get back to work. So I decided for the first time I would pay to have it butchered so that I could get back to work. I'd spent a lot of time trying to hunt and now I needed to catch up on work. And
Yeah.
for like 24 hours while that deer was in my mom and stepdad's garage, I was just feeling so depressed. I was like in such a funk and I like in a fog. I was like, what is wrong with me? And then I realized, no, I don't send it to the butcher. You have to do it. And
Yeah.
I woke up like the next day. I went into the garage. Me and my girlfriend butchered the whole thing. And with every cut on that deer, my energy came back and like my good spirits came back. And it was just kind of like, it's just interesting. I don't even
Yeah.
really know what to say other
Yeah,
than
you obviously have a very deep connection with nature in general. I will say that like when I do harvest an animal, there's something that's really special about the all the processes of it, whether it's processing the meat or just
yes,
making that meal, right?
yes, so special.
I love to cook with wild game. If I
Oh,
don't have any wild game in the freezer, like cooking's a chore for me.
oh,
It's just about getting calories so I can keep moving. But when I have wild game, it becomes something special. And I don't know what that is, but I think it's something in line with what you're talking about here. There's a connection to, the animals that we're
I,
harvesting
I
and
think
the entire
there's like
process.
I think that there's like something like at an energy level. Like there's something. I almost think that wild game is medicinal. For instance, we moved last winter, so I couldn't really hunt. I did a bunch of squirrel hunting. So I've this entire late winter, spring, and summer, we've had no wild game. Which for the past 5 years, we've always had deer meat that's gone into like the late spring. So
Hmm.
that was like kind of a bummer. Or we'd had beaver meat to go into the late spring. So now that we moved, um, I would buy organic beef from the grocery store. And this a little bit of TMI, but I would have the most disgusting gas. And I was like, this meat, there's something fucked up. I was like, I know it's organic, but there's something like it's not right. Like every
Yeah.
time I make these meals, there's something disgusting about it. So I was like, okay, well, let's buy meat from the local farmers, even if it might not be organic. So I started doing that. That went away, and I felt way better. You could feel it's more high quality. Then last week was the first day of squirrel season. I cooked a squirrel for me and Vivian, my girlfriend, and we were like voracious. Like we were eating that, like it,
Huh.
we were eating it with such speed and intensity that I was like, there's there's like medicinal value in this food, and our bodies know it. Like
Yeah.
the wild game, there's something going on where it is what has way more value. Like the body can tell it's higher quality.
Yeah, you know what? It's funny that you say there's like a medicinal quality to it. So I've had Jeremiah Dottie on the podcast. He's from Field to Plate, so he's a chef, and he actually became
Mm,
allergic to beef. He was working in restaurants, and that's really what got him into hunting. He'd hunted his whole life, but what really pushed him was when he all of a sudden developed this beef allergy. And this is
mm,
actually going to be we talk about it in his podcast, which was released 2 weeks ago.
mm,
And then I talk about it in a podcast that's about to be released, but he is going to Hawaii because in Hawaii they have wild cattle, right?
mm.
And so they're going to go on a cow hunt, a cattle hunt. It got postponed a little bit due to COVID and things like that. But his hypothesis and a lot of people's hypothesis, these wild animals, that he'll be able to eat it and he won't have the same allergic concerns. And there's something more to do with how these animals are raised. And there's something funky going on with that meat, maybe how they're executed. I don't know, but there's a lot of people that believe that he'll be able to eat that beef without having any of his allergic reactions that he normally has. So it's something that I think he's doing this year. But check out that podcast. Check out
Mm.
him in general from Field to
Thank you.
Plate. Super interesting stuff, and it's kind of in line that like yeah, wild game is medicinal. It's exactly what you said, and that's the hypothesis that they're actually looking to prove.
That's a great experiment.
Yeah.
And I guess um, on that note, there is if you're listening to this and you have kids, I don't have kids yet. Um, a book that I cannot recommend more highly is Wild Woods Wisdom, Encounters with the Natural World. It's written by a man named Doug Elliott. He's in the mountains of North Carolina. He's an herbalist, but he's also like a folklorist. He's a storyteller, a singer songwriter. This guy is so wonderful and
Yeah.
just like really folky. And when he was young, he moved to the mountains of North Carolina, and he would study from like the old timers and get a lot of the folklore. He has a chapter in that book where he talks about observing groundhogs. And he kept hearing from old timers in Appalachia how medicinal not only the groundhog meat was, but the groundhog fat, which they would like render into like a salve. So a salve is like a is like a cream
Yeah.
in herbalism that it's like a balm. And back in the day, those would be made with tallow or with animal fats. You can do it with bear fat. A lot of herbalists will say that bear fat is one of the best fats for making salves, medicinal salves
Hmm.
that you would mix with herbs. I don't quite know the process, but anyways, he was learning from old timers that they kept talking about groundhog grease for like healing their arthritis and other stuff. I can't quite remember everything from the
Huh.
chapter, but he started observing, he started watching groundhogs and sneaking up on them. And he noticed that all of the plants that they were eating were medicinal plants. They'd be eating like dandelion and
That's so
violet.
interesting. Yeah.
Yes. And so if you get into herbalism, you'll find out a lot of those weeds are highly medicinal. So here the groundhog is eating medicinal plants, and the old timers are saying that the meat and the fat are medicinal. And it's like, well, it is what it eats.
Yeah. No, I believe it. I believe it. That makes total
Incredible.
sense. That makes total
Incredible.
sense.
And
Yeah.
and recently over kind of in your neck of the woods, I read Journal of a Trapper. Have you read that?
I have not.
Awesome book. It's something Osborne. I can't remember his first name. He was a trapper in the 1800s out west, mountain man. So this is it's his memoir, his journal. He talks about getting into a skirmish with Native Americans it's like he's ambushed. His buddy just swam in the river. He's taking a nap against a tree. All of a sudden, they look up and there are a handful of Native Americans running towards them. They run off. Flurry of arrows come at them. He gets hit in the leg, and then they have to like escape from all this. But later on, to treat the wound on his leg, he bathes it in salt water,
Ouch.
and
Okay.
beaver oil. And I think it's beaver castor oil. And the same things, there's the same ideas. The beavers are eating these trees, and a lot of those trees have medicinal value, like the aspen, stuff like that. So like maybe there really is something to putting beaver fat on your wound.
I believe it. 100%. Man, this has been fun, Philippe. I really do appreciate you jumping on, man. I want to encourage everybody there. I think I'm going to wrap up because we're about to get kicked out of Zoom for a second time here.
Thank you, man.
Of course. But I want to encourage everyone to check out your podcast and your artwork. I know you talked a little bit briefly after the raccoon trapping story about your beaver trapping. Episode 1 goes all into that. It's a great episode.
Thank you.
And everybody should check out what you're doing. His podcast has things from Pirates of the Chesapeake Bay, manhunting, trapping, herbalism. There's just all sorts of super interesting stuff. I won't lie, I haven't listened to all of them, but that's just because I just discovered you and I'm working my way through them. So again, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. I'm going to definitely stay in touch, and I think we should have you back on once you have a couple more stories. And why don't you tell the people? I mean, obviously, I'm rattling off things about you, but why don't you tell people where they can find your podcast, where they can find your artwork, and I know you have some products for sale and stuff like that. So why don't you give the people that, since we have about a minute and a half left before we're kicked off here?
Okay, so it's called Our Numinous Nature, NUMINOUS. That's the Instagram account and the podcast. I'm a professional illustrator, so I've been illustrating for small hunting companies, homesteaders, nonprofits that are have to do with nature and whatnot. I love doing all that stuff. I love illustrating other people's concepts, whether it's a logo for their small business, etc. So that's all there. And the podcast, that's the name. And I'm honored to be on yours, and I got to get deeper in yours too. Appreciate it.
Yeah, man. It's just people telling stories, so it's a lot of fun.
I love it.
But cool, man. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I know it took us a couple tries to get this thing done because of some internet issues, but it was well worth the wait.
Thanks, brother. Look forward to staying in touch.
Absolutely. All right, guys. That's it. Another bunch of stories in the books. I want to say thank you to Philippe for jumping on. We had a little bit of technical difficulties getting this thing recorded and had to reschedule a few times, since he does live in very rural West Virginia. But that being said, he went out of his way to make sure that we got this thing done. So thank you again. I really appreciate you taking your time. And of course, I appreciate your stories, and I appreciate your podcast. So that being said, get out there and listen to his podcast, Our Numinous Nature. It's great. It's super interesting. And there's all sorts of different subjects. So other than that, guys, thank you very much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. We're still looking for more storytellers, so if you have a great story, hit us up. Again, if your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister, your cousin, your drunk uncle, whoever has a good story, hit us up. We want to hear them. Beyond that, please go rate and review the podcast and share it with some friends. We want to grow this thing so we can hear more and more stories. The more people that know about it, the more people that will be reaching out. Well, that's it, guys. Thank you again for tuning in. I appreciate it. Philippe, thank you, of course, for your stories. And everybody out there, go make some stories of your own.